Based on my last video, there were a lot of questions that came in on how to sell your practice. So I'm going to cover the 12 most common questions that were asked, and really this should put you on solid ground when thinking of selling your practice. And maybe before I do, who am I? I'm Dr. Michael, founder of transitionselite.com. We specialize in multi-DVM practices, and we've sold over $250 million worth of practices. So all of these answers are going to come from real life experience. So how is the value of your practice calculated? Well, really, for a multi-DVM practice right now, it's between 7 to 15 times EBITDA. And the main factors that go into that calculation are the practice size, the location, whether it's urban, rural, or suburban. And rural and suburban can still be very viable as long as it's in an area where we can recruit vets. Not we, but the buyers can recruit vets, because that's the key consideration. Is the practice and has it been growing? If it's been stagnating, then that's going to be a big ding on the valuation. Specialty versus general is important. Most of the practices tend to be general. The number of exam rooms is a critical factor because the buyer wants to know if they're going to be able to grow within the facility or if they'll have to do a move. If they have to do a move, that will be a big value killer. And next is the number of DVMs and the strength of the team. And so one of the big considerations of the buyer is that if you are a huge producer within the practice, what happens if you leave or get hit by a bus? And so being able to show that the associates would be able to pick up the slack will make sure that you're able to achieve those top valuations. And the next question that's come in is, what are the common add backs to EBITDA? One of the most important things to do when you're working with a broker or advisor is they are going to create this EBITDA that has all the add backs of one-time expenses. And this can be dramatic for your practice. So here's examples. So it's one-time or non-recurring expenses. This could be equipment. This could be legal fees. This could be any fees getting ready to sell. The Transitions Elite, we don't charge any fees up front. So that's not included in this, but you might have gotten accountants to be able to do a review of your practice beforehand to get it ready. And that would be an example of one-time fees. Any owner expenses that you have, for example, car, cell phone, any travel or food that could be put on the practice P&L. Family member salaries is very common. Here we are, the personal vehicles and travel, charitable contributions. If you have any litigation or compliance costs that was from a one-time event, or excess of rent. So normalizing the rent according to what the market rate is for the rent in your area. And also, if you've done any big one-time marketing expenses that were a trial or a test, those can all be justified. And so really it's the logic of justifying why these were one time and why the buyer isn't going to have to incur these on a regular basis. So the next question is, what does a typical earnout structure look like? Well, it really depends upon the risk that the buyer sees within your practice. But typically about 10 to 20% of the total purchase price will be put into an earnout. And the buyer's goal is that you're going to stick around. The disaster for them if you buy it, have all the money in your account, and then you leave. So what are the common metrics that really are tied to the earnout? Number one is revenue growth. Also, it can be a certain level of EBITDA and retention of key staff. And of course, your employment is going to be contingent on the earnout. The key thing is they want to have you around. Now, what we do with our clients is we negotiate as strongly as possible to only have one key metric, and that would be a give me revenue growth. On the other hand, you will have to be employed. So that's always going to be part of the earnout. So one metric and then one other stipulation, which is your employment. And what can you also build into this? If they have EBITDA or revenue growth, you can have a minimum staffing to make sure they don't remove staff and then handicap the practice from being able to achieve those targets, and also make up provisions. So if you have an earnout that's 2 to 3 years and you miss the first year, you want to make sure that you can be able to hit that second and third year and get the full 3 years rather than just the last 2 by having this makeup provision. So when is the best time to sell my practice? Well, one of the key drivers is market timing. So right now we are in a private equity consolidation cycle. And so this is why it's such an amazing time. The valuations are 2 to 3x the historical valuations, and they will go back to that point once private equity leaves the industry. So really understanding that cycle, and now we're in a great time. Interest rates have a significant impact, although right now, even though the interest rates are still in a medium territory, private equity has been refinancing, and so they are in buying mode. So it's an excellent time to sell the practice now, but it won't last forever. The private equity interest in your region. And so once private equity rolls through and they have a number of practices in a certain area, they will not go ahead and buy more. And the more private equity organizations that either consolidate or that drop out of acquiring a certain region significantly impacts valuations for you because if there's less bidders, then there's going to be less negotiation and your valuation is going to drop. And that's specific to your local area. So it's very important to know the timing, not just across the entire nation, but also in your local state, in your local area, to know the buyer appetite. And I'll show you how to figure that out at the end. Finally, there's a risk of veterinary innovations that could be disrupting future revenue. I'm going to be doing an entire video on what these disrupting factors could be. So just click subscribe or the like button, and then you'll get access to that video as it gets developed. But this is the one that keeps me up at night because there are a number of players entering the market. They're really increasing their game from what historical practices look like, both in terms of technology, sophistication, and scale. And secondly, there's a lot of brand new AI tools that could really change the way that clients think about a veterinary practice. And it could also impact the labor market. And so what would happen if a significant amount of your clients suddenly were unemployed because of AI-based layoffs? If your revenue starts to flatline or drop, that's going to have a dramatic negative impact on your valuation. So what is the optimal sale timeline? Well, this total process should take between 5 to 6 months. And the goal is to get this done as quickly as possible once you make the decision. So there's a rush to make the decision based on market timing and the market cycle. But once you make that decision, it's extremely important that we move quickly. And why is that? Because things can change and suddenly that window is gone and now your valuation has decreased by 30 to 50%. What's a typical timeline? So it's about a month. So for example, if you were to have a call with myself or my colleague, then we would be able to take a look at your practice, say, yep, this is the right time we should go for, or you should wait 2 to 3 years, do these few different aspects, and then come back to us to get a premium valuation. So once it's a go, it's about 1 month to get your practice ready, really to get all your data, put it in a data room, and to create this marketing package to go out to the premium buyers. And not just any buyer, but the buyers that we know do what they say they're going to do and have a good cultural fit for your practice. Once we have that package, it's about a 3-week period from contacting all the buyers, getting them ready, having them sign confidentiality agreements, and getting them access to what's called a data room that has all your data. Then we bring everyone together in a very orchestrated bidding process. So you'll have multiple bidders, between 3 to 6 really great buyers that are bidding on your practice. They'll likely fly to your clinic. They'll visit it when it's closed on the weekend. And really, everyone's going to know that everyone else is vying for it. And we are going to ask them to put their best offer forward because they know if they don't, it's going to get taken by one of the other great buyers. And this is what really drives the value for your practice. And then finally, once an LOI is signed or letter of intent, it's about a 3 to 4 month process to do the due diligence. And again, this is where being organized and having a driver that's driving your process is so absolutely critical. And an example of how this goes wrong, I was involved with a veterinarian that was buying a practice, and they were just listed by a standard broker. Now, a standard broker views their job as listing your practice on a website. And then when a buyer comes, they just negotiate with that one buyer. And once they sign the LOI, it's kind of up to you and your lawyers to be able to work through the rest. And it was such an absolute disaster that the veterinarian buying it thought, oh my gosh, I want this practice. And so he ended up paying $45,000 of additional legal fees to do the legal work of the practice owner who is selling, because the practice owner's lawyer was so slow and incompetent that the deal would have never gotten done. Now, the veterinarian had the patience to do this, but the big buyers that you really want to be selling to, they will not tolerate it. They don't mind spending the big bucks, but they want to make sure that this transaction happens and happens quickly. And they don't want to deal with some rinky-dink local lawyer that's acting smart, redlining all of the contracts and causing delays in the communication. So what we tend to do is we will recommend a deal-making lawyer to the practices that we will take to market. Why? And we have a selection, so there's no real preference, except there's about 3 to 4 that are really good. And why is that? Because these folks know how to get it done. They know how to work fast. They know the deal terms, and they aren't going to be an impediment to this process. They're going to work with you to protect your interests and get the deal done. Whereas if you use your local attorney, they might be great at estate planning. They might be great in family issues, but you bring them into a deal-making situation and they're really going to be outgunned. And so you don't want that to create this delay in the process. Every single day of delay has the potential to significantly decrease your valuation, because the buyer will say, oh, well, look at your revenue, it just dropped off, or, oh, You just have a veterinarian that now is going away on leave, that changes the whole thing, and they'll drop the price by millions. And so it's very important that this due diligence process happens quickly and you have a great team that's driving it every step of the way. And the best time to sell is when you're emotionally and psychologically ready and the market is hungry, so that you have buyers that are hungry for your practice in your local area. So what are the key documents that you need to prepare? Well, basically it's 3 years. They want to look back 3 years. So they want 3 years of your financial statements, tax returns, and your monthly P&L. So they want to see what's been the trend coming up recently. Next, you want to have the practice management data. So this is, for example, clients, new clients, average transaction value, production by DVM. Again, you're painting the picture of what your practice looks like to the buyer. And by the way, that's exactly what we will cover, not in the free practice value estimate, that you can just talk it out. But when we actually get going and engage, we go through all this through the eyes of the buyer to understand what are the weaknesses of your practice, how can we shore up those weaknesses, and really position it in the best light. Next is employee files, so contracts, licenses, certificates, and any performance reviews. If you do not have contracts, this is a big, hairy issue that the buyers are going to force to happen before they buy. And the timing of this is very important because you want to time it so that it's not going to throw the deal off by sharing it too early with your staff, but do it in an elegant way that's not going to throw a wrench into the process. And so the timing of this, I'll do a future video exactly on how and when to tell your team. Again, just hit the like button and you'll be able to see it, because this is a nuanced process that drives a lot of, or can be a big value killer. Next is facility. So again, making sure that your leases are up to date, making sure that you have a lease between your entities if you own the real estate and the practice. These are all going to be critical things for the buyer to be able to review. And of course, your legal and insurance, any corporate documents and corporate records. And by the way, if you don't have these things, you don't have to freak out. That's exactly why you need to have a really good advisor that just goes boom, 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 boom. Oh, you don't have this? No problem. We'll get that recreated for you so that you have everything in place. So what types of buyers are there? Well, number one, there's the traditional corporate consolidator. These are the ones that change your name, change your protocols, change everything about your practice. And veterinarians do not like selling to corporate consolidators in general. So that's the old school buyer, but you're not forced to sell to that even to get the highest valuations, because the highest valuations are the private equity firms. And these folks are really financial buyers. They just want access to your cash flow. They're not in the operational business. They don't want to practice medicine. So they want to keep everything the same, but just be able to put your cash flow onto their balance sheet and be able to get the arbitrage between what they pay for your practice and what they get paid by grouping lots of practices together. But this is a great scenario for a practice owner because they really want to maintain the legacy and maintain the direction that the practice has been going in. Next is individual veterinarians. If you have a multi-doctor practice, an individual veterinarian just won't be able to afford the financing to be able to make a purchase. If you have a 1 or 1.5 doctor practice, well, then really the individual veterinarian is going to be the target market that is going to be buying your practice. And then finally, it'll be regional groups. This could be a veterinarian that has several other practices or a very small equity-backed group. And these are also very viable because if they get any funding, they can come out and really want to put together a basket of practices in a certain region. When a buyer is looking at your practice, really, how do they evaluate it? Well, we've talked about a number of these items, but it's financial strength, staff retention history, the growth strategy, and what is your presence within the local market? Are you the dominant practice? Is there another dominant practice in the area? What's the competitive landscape that looks like? How dependent is it on the owner DVM? What are the local demographics? Is it wealthy? Is it not wealthy? And what do they feel that the future demographic growth rate is going to be in your area? Does your facility have room for expansion? Is it just 2 exam rooms? That will really impact your valuation. Or do you have a 4 exam room facility and you can really see getting that practice up to $5 to $6 million within that facility size? And what is the stability and commitment of the associate DVMs within your practice? If you own the real estate, what items should you consider in relation to your real estate? This is a big question. So firstly, it's going to be the tax implications of selling your real estate at the same time of your practice. That's going to create a significant transaction within the same calendar year. And you'll probably get dinged much higher from a tax perspective by lumping those 2 things together. So typically what we advise is that the owner keeps the practice and they just sell the practice. And then they can keep as an annuity the rent that's coming from the practice. And then what's your ability to redeploy that capital at a higher yield? So if you're a savvy investor, well, then maybe you should sell the practice and you can invest that capital. But if you're not, and most practice owners are not, then holding on to that practice is such an amazing asset because it just produces cash flow year upon year upon year, preserving the legacy for your family and also for yourself into your retirement. So it typically is the best move to hold on to the real estate. And you have a great tenant because it's a veterinary practice and they are really recession resilient, which is why private equity is so interested in our industry. And the leases should always be triple net leases, typically on at least a 5-year triple renewal basis. So it comes out to about 10 to 15 years in terms of a commitment to the buyer who's buying it. But typically that isn't an issue from practice owner selling side because they want to have them as a tenant. So what exactly happens during due diligence? Well, it's two things really. It's a financial review to verify all the numbers that you had shared, that they have real comfort that those are in fact correct. And then an operational review. So really to understand the dynamics of your client base, to understand the dynamics of your average transaction value, your DVM production, and also what's the makeup of your staff? How are the contracts? How long have the staff been? Are there going to be any labor liabilities from the duration of staff that were within your practice? The last 2 weeks will be staff interviews. So that's when they'll actually meet the staff and they'll just make sure there's no huge red herrings in your staff in terms of the quality of the DVMs and the quality of the staff, and really to assess finally the culture is within your clinic. We touch on the client base analysis, and finally they'll review in detail your equipment and your facility, and also to understand what kind of leases that you're involved with and whether the lease goes with the transaction or whether you have to pay off the lease and then they'll bring in their own leases. Typically it's the latter because they can negotiate much better pricing on leases versus just assuming the ones that you have created. And so how can you maintain confidentiality? This is a very important question for practice owners because the last thing that you want is everyone to know that you're selling the practice when it's not even a done deal. And so how can you maintain that when you start to go out and engage buyers? So the first thing that we do is we have every buyer sign a very strict non-disclosure agreement. And the buyers are sophisticated, so they know the importance of confidentiality. We've never had an issue with this. All the meetings are done. So once the buyers engage, review your financial information and say, yes, I would like to really investigate this further and put in an offer. We then fly everyone in together the same weekend. They know the other buyers are coming. And while the facility is closed and nobody's around, they get to do a walkthrough. They get to sit down with you as the practice owner. You get to interview them to understand the culture of their organization. And they're really interviewing you to make sure that you're someone that they can foresee working with and working with their teams. But at this stage, there's still complete confidentiality. And then finally, within the last 2 weeks, that's when they're introduced to the team. And it's at a quick enough pace that your team might be nervous about it, but they realize there's going to be a lot of benefits from this new buyer. For example, increased benefits, increased paid time off, usually increased continuing education. And it's such a short window that they aren't going to go start looking for other jobs. They're going to ride it out. And the buyers that we work with are really good at coming in, letting everybody relax and showing them what the big benefit is for them for staying with the practice. And so it typically isn't a problem as long as it's structured in a very meticulous way. And so what exactly happens after the sale? Well, immediately the merchant account and all of the major systems within the practice get shifted over to the buyer. Now, what happens is you as the seller are still paying a number of expenses, but that's okay. It's expected. This is what happens in the deal. And so what will happen is there'll be a true up. So 3 to 6 months later, you'll be able to say, hey, I paid $40,000 of expenses, and the buyer will reimburse you for that. The buyer will take over and really put into place communication plans to let your staff know about this transition, what's going to happen, what are the expectations, what's the new performance review process. And so this is all on the buyer's shoulders. And finally, it's going to be HR and back office that gets handed over to the buyer, which is a huge relief for you as the seller, because now you can just focus on being a veterinarian and seeing your best clients. So really, it's always a bit bumpy in terms of which systems are on and where the money's flowing with the merchant account. But after about 3 months, all that's smoothed over and the clients don't realize any of this. So this is really just back of office, back of house stuff that has to be worked out. And how can you protect yourself during the sale? So the first one is really negotiating the letter of intent and having that extremely detailed. What junior brokers tend to do is they get excited about the LOI. Senior brokers, M&A advisors, when we see an LOI, that is when we are negotiating the nuances because we don't want to engage with a buyer, lock up your practice for a 3-month period, only to find that there was a miscommunication on what the sale was actually going to look like. And next is to have an advisor who's an expert in the industry. So this is in the veterinary profession that knows these buyers from doing multiple different transactions. Now, for example, for us, we only work with the sellers, so we don't take a dollar from the buyers, but we know which buyers do what they say they're going to do and which buyers play games and which buyers don't even have any money, but are trying to lock up your practice, and then they're going to go shop it out to try to get the money. And what happens is, and this is a fascinating situation, is if they play games with you during that transaction. So for example, a very common thing that buyers will do, these sophisticated financial buyers, is a week before when you've told all the staff, they'll say, oh, you know what? We were going to do 12 million. Well, now we can only do 9. And so in that situation, we tell that buyer, look, here's why it's worth 12 million. They're not going to accept a penny less. And if you do this with this practice owner, then we have several other practices that you're involved with bidding on right now. We'll tell them that this is the behavior that you as a buyer are doing. And so I don't think that we should go ahead with that transaction because you might play games with them. Inevitably, what happens, they call back and they say, okay, we'll do the 12 million. So having that advisor that can hold the buyers accountable is a critical part of how you can get that high valuation and see it through right to the finish line. And then speed of due diligence, we've talked about. Any delays are going to delay this total sale price in your practice, and making sure that you have as much cash as possible in the transaction and as little earnout or rollover into the buyer's entity, because that is really where the risk comes. And for you, you know the buyer to a certain extent, but you don't want to put many eggs in that basket. You want to have your cash. You want to be able to invest your cash. And 10 to 20% in an earnout is fine, but anything more than that is making the deal more risky for you as the seller. And so if you have any questions that weren't covered in this, even though these were the most common, the place to start is with a free practice value estimate. And so that's where you'll speak with either myself or my team. And what you're going to do is no preparation is needed. We'll research your practice, your local area. We know the buyers. We know what areas they're looking at. We're going to provide you with estimated value, and you can just talk out what your numbers are, what your situation is, how many exam rooms, how many doctors, what the demographics are. And based on the information, we'll give you a really good idea on what your practice value looks like today. And is it better to sell now, or is it better to wait based on the market timing? And also how to significantly juice that value of your practice. So what are the 3 things that you can do right now that will increase the valuation, either if you're selling in the short term or if you're selling from a 2 to 5 year window out. So it's very important that you start with this conversation, even if you're just thinking of selling your practice, because this is going to be the core strategic move that you're then going to be able to build around to get the maximum value and the best deal terms when it comes time to sell. Because it's not just about the financial, it's also about, are you going to be trapped in that practice for a 4 or 5 year period if it's very risky, or will you be able to get out in 2 to 3 years because you're able to show the stability of the practice. So that link is just in the description below. Check the availability. Often there's a waiting list, but go ahead and click the link and check. And if that works, we'll speak together and really make sure that we get the best value and deal terms for your practice. So see you in the next video.